Hi guys, happy slightly delayed New Year's and welcome back aboard good old Athena. It is a long-standing tradition for me to put out a year in review video around New Year's, and this year is no different. So I've sat down and I've edited all of the footage from 2022 down to around 17 minutes. The videos are currently about 3 weeks behind real time. We've done that to save up videos so that we can continue to publish a video every Sunday at 8 p.m. even during our upcoming Atlantic crossing. So if everything has gone according to plan, by the time you guys see this video, we should be in the Canary Islands and in fact be almost about to start our Atlantic crossing. Now during the Atlantic crossing, we will be doing real-time updates and real-time position reports for our patrons. So if that sounds cool, there's a link for our Patreon page down in the description. We started out the new year in Gosport in the UK where we had spent the winter. The first project of the year was to make cones for a series drogue, an easy but very time-consuming task. Then it was on to installing our new Rainman Watermaker. I installed the control panel in the head and found room for the two membranes above the genset. I adhered a big piece of 20mm plywood in place and mounted the membranes to that. The motor with the high pressure pump and the feed pump found a home next to our hydronic heating manifold. The installation was a breeze, and in no time we were ready to take the Rainman for a spin. In the beginning of 2022, we still had doors and lockers that needed to be taped shut before sailing. After lots of taping, we left Gosport and moved Athena to Chichester for a couple of weeks. There were a lot of firsts in 2022. For instance, the lock into Chichester was our first ever lock. Our main reason for going to Chichester was to meet up with James, who has the most amazing woodworking shop I have ever set foot in. James not only let us use his workshop, but he also helped us make all the trim and doohickeys we wanted to make. Like for instance, new companionway doors, new washboards, Ava's much celebrated new spiffy spice rack, and new companionway trim, just to name a few items. After 2 weeks in Chichester, Athena looked a lot more finished. On a nice calm day, we left Chichester and headed back to Gosport to continue working on our very ambitious to-do list. Back in Gosport, we were fortunate enough to find a true DIY gold mine in the shape of Make Gosport, a fully equipped maker spot where I could make new solar panel supports for our arch. Like a glove. One of the big downsides to Volvo's D2 engines are their MDI boxes, which are well known to have issues. Without an MDI box, you have to manually short the starter to start the engine, and you're also left without oil pressure or temperature monitoring. Using a few relays, an oil filter adapter plate, and a couple of buttons and a horn, I made a backup box that will allow us to start the engine with the push of a button and still give us oil pressure and temperature monitoring even without the MDI box. On the way to the UK, we had noticed some range issues with our VHF radio. To deal with that and also to install a new staysail furler, we had Marine Rigging Services unstep the mast. I replaced the coax cable and did the assembly of the furler and installed a second camera in the mast while the mast was down. While we waited for the rigger to replace all of our running rigging, we installed 1600 watts worth of solar panels on the arch. When unfurled, the solar panel array looks giant, but I am happy to report 0 issues so far. The solar installation was finished with 2 MPPT chargers, and on a sunny winter day we got our first trickle of solar juice. With all of the work on the mast done, the riggers re-stepped the mast. One of the major milestones for 2022 was replacing all of Athena's old sails. With the mast back on the boat, we could finally bend on our new sails from Precision Sails. Speaking of new things, we also replaced Athena's old 2-stroke 4-horse outboard with an electric outboard. We have since then talked about also getting a 15-horse 2-stroke in the Caribbean for longer distances, but for now it is nice to have a lightweight rechargeable outboard. Our time in Gosport had come to an end. We untied the lines, waved goodbye to our good friends Mark and Marcella, and headed to Southampton to meet up with Carly and Dom from Sailing Cadoa. We didn't think so at the time, but we ended up reuniting with all these people again a little bit later in 2022. Remember the need to tape doors and lockers shut I mentioned a little bit earlier? Before leaving the UK, I finally got around to installing the door handle on the door to the head. A life of luxury indeed. We only had to wait a couple of days before we had a weather window to cross the English Channel. Our destination was Cherbourg in France, where we planned to finish the last of the items on our winter to-do list. After an uneventful passage, we arrived just as the sun started to set. Left on the to-do list was lots of smaller jobs like installing our new Dometic hood range and hooking up the windlass, which included a wireless remote and a chain counter. Finally, having a working windlass felt really good, and it meant we could do lots of anchoring in 2022. One of the most memorable things for me during our stay in Cherbourg was heading to Selden's factory in France and getting a tour there, and also picking up our new rod kicker and a super spiffy E40i electric winch. I immediately installed the rod kicker and the power supply on the controller and of course the winch itself as soon as we got back to the boat. We now have the option of doing almost all of our line handling using electricity rather than human power. There we have it, unfurling our mainsail without breaking a sweat. Ava really got into sewing and needle related projects while we were in Cherbourg. She made some super spiffy covers for our jerry cans and also made an equally spiffy cover for our propane tank. Ava also applied leather to our steering wheel as well as the grab rails on the spray hood.
This brown looks so nice with the blue enclosure. I love it!
Speaking of things to grab, we also installed super shiny stainless grab rails on the fiberglass Dodger and on the cabin tub to have something to hold on to when going up forward. Also on the to-do list was a preventer for the boom to keep the accidental decapitations to an absolute minimum. I made some Dyneema loops with low friction rings rather than using snatch blocks, and with the preventer and the main sheet in place, the boom is firmly held in place. There were still plenty of items left on the to-do list, like for instance installing a 4,000 gallons per hour or 15,000 liters per hour emergency bilge pump. I also got more of the trim from James' workshop installed, along with other minor woodworking projects like the hatch for the nav station seat. In terms of running cables on a small sailboat, thick coax cable like the stuff for our Iridium Go antenna is probably some of the worst stuff to work with. But with the antenna in place, we should now have no issues getting offshore weather forecasts. Ava went to IKEA and picked up 2 cheap mattresses for us to use in the aft cabin. With surprisingly few houses being shaped like sailboats, a bit of modification was required, but after that we now have another good bunk for offshore passages. And just like that, our time in France was up. We had a reasonable weather window to go straight to Ireland and left Cherbourg in high spirits for what was supposed to be our first overnight passage. Unfortunately, I got seasick and we decided to divert to Brixham in the UK. While not planned, this turned out to be a blessing in disguise. We were sad that we hadn't seen much of the south coast, but due to this unforeseen detour, we got to visit some of the spots that make the south coast of the UK so amazing to cruise. While still in the UK, I got the chance to dive on the hull and check how the copper coat was doing after 2 years in the water. Fortunately, there was no growth on the hull, but we did have a bunch of barnacles on the prop. We continued along the south coast all the way to the Isles of Scilly, where we got to enjoy what's lovingly nicknamed the Caribbean of Europe, with crystal clear water and white sandy beaches. We waited here for a few days looking for a perfect weather window to go to Ireland. With my confidence shaken after my recent bout with seasickness, we chose a very conservative weather window that meant flat seas, but also not a lot of wind. We got a warm welcome in Ireland by the best dolphin show of 2022. After having raised the Irish courtesy flag, we made our way up the river before tying up in Cork City Marina. The marina consists of a single pontoon, but it is right in the center of Cork. While in the area, we visited the Middleton Distillery, which is famous for Jameson's whiskey. That was a lot of fun, especially the tasting. Unfortunately, we think that's also where we managed to pick up COVID. Unaware of the ticking COVID clock, I replaced our outhaul where the cover had snapped, and we pushed on heading west. If there is one thing I'll remember from Ireland, it's how friendly the people were. Thanks to Tim and Heather, we had a mooring ball in Glandore where we could recover from COVID without passing it on to anyone else. We even got brought flowers, local honey and groceries. Thank you so much to everyone who helped us get back on our feet. Because of COVID and weather, we didn't get to go up the west coast of Ireland as I had originally hoped, but we did make it to Baltimore, which is the most western part of Ireland, and we spent a few days on Hare Island enjoying the nature and the bird cliffs, where I got my best bird pooping shot of 2022. Eventually we managed to get a weather window to go south to Brest in France. That should have been around a 2 to 3 day passage. This time, our plans didn't change because of seasickness, but because of the drive unit for our autopilot that failed. It was on, but it's like it's not holding the heading. For f***'s sake. We ended up hand steering to Plymouth with a short stop in the Helford River. Once we were securely tied up in Mayflower Marina in Plymouth, Garmin very quickly sent us a new drive unit. Ava flew off to the US to be with her sister for the birth of our niece. That meant I was free to go nuts and DIY to my heart's content. There were a bunch of smaller projects like cleaning out our water tank, installing a new accumulator tank, replacing the fuel pump on the genset that had died due to my forgetfulness, and then there was also a leaky chain plate that needed fixing. One of the biggest visual improvements of the summer was to install yet more of the trim we had made at James's workshop, like for instance this big curved piece above the V-berth. We had noticed some chafe on our Dyneema lifelines and decided to replace the top ones with stainless wire rope. Up until this point, our doors had been raw unpainted plywood. After a quick few coats of paint, they looked a lot more finished. One of my biggest fears about heading south is the heat. What most boats seem to do is to fit a bunch of these 12-volt fans. It was pretty warm in Plymouth at this time, so it was the perfect time for me to do the same. To make sure our new autopilot drive unit was well protected and that we could start utilizing the cockpit locker for storage, I built a cover or cowling for the drive unit. I made it out of 10mm foam core with a few layers of fiberglass. After a light bit of fairing and a bit of paint, the cover looked pretty dang spiffy. I decided the cockpit locker would also be the best place for us to store our scuba tanks. To do that in a secure fashion, I built a little shelf out of 18mm plywood. That was secured to the transom with some T-nuts and plywood that got adhered directly to the transom to make this shelf removable. We could now finally start using the cockpit locker. We still had 2 more jobs to take care of before we could start using the staysail furler I assembled in Gosport, and that was to install some tracks up on the deck and also to get the sheets routed back to the cockpit. There was still a little bit of exposed plywood in the aft cabin. I had some 4mm plywood left over and I decided to use that to beautify the aft cabin. I adhered it in place and used a router to open up the holes for the port lights before finally sealing and painting the plywood and then reinstalling the port lights. Our stove up until this point did not have a pot retention device, and I also needed to rewire the stove. Both were easily fixed, and just like that we now have a much more secure cooking platform. Of noteworthy projects in 2022 was also finally having a toilet paper holder in the head. It did require the use of an angle drilling doohickey, but not having the toilet paper flying all over the place was well worth the effort. The last project in Plymouth was to get our grill permanently attached in the cockpit. Thank you so much to Mike for our new stainless steel grill holder. With Ava back on the boat, we headed back to the Helford River to wait for a weather window to go to France. In Helford, we met up with not only our friends aboard Cadoa, but also our friends aboard Taylor, and also Mark and Marcella from Gosport. I got a chance to make a right fool out of myself on Mark's e-foil, which is probably the most fun I've had in years, despite all of the oh glorious sanding. While we were waiting for weather, I installed new curtains and sky screens from Dometic using some Iruko frames that James from Chichester had made for us. The sky screens have both a curtain and a screen for keeping out bugs. We got a really nice weather window to cross the English Channel for the 4th time. I remember being a little bit nervous on our first crossing, but we've never had any issues. We didn't stay in Brest for that long, but I did have time to install a shower in the cockpit, something I think will be really nice to have in the warmer places and also just for rinsing off scuba gear. And there was also time for installing Starlink. This is one of my favorite additions to Athena, as it has meant fast and stable internet without the need for hunting for SIM cards. For many sailors, crossing the Bay of Biscay is a big milestone. We had a decent weather window, but nothing better in sight, and it was getting late in the season. We had a delightfully calm passage without any issues, but we did have to motor for about 12 hours. The full moon was a big plus that made the night watches a lot more fun, and after about 2.5 days, we spotted the coast of Spain and pulled into Gijón. After a short stay, we headed to A Coruña, accompanied by dolphins and nice warm weather. This is where we first started to feel like we were finally heading south, and we also developed a little bit of a melon addiction. The single biggest source of worry for us in 2022 has been orcas and their attacks on sailboats along the Spanish and Portuguese coasts. Our friends aboard Westwind were unfortunate enough to get attacked right outside of A Coruña. The orcas meant day jumping down the coast and sticking to around 20 to 30 meters of water. It also meant traveling with other sailboats whenever we got the chance. Despite the orcas, we still got to enjoy some lovely places along the coast, like for instance Camarinas, where Eva got to admire tons of lace, and where we first noticed the granaries that are so common in Spain and Portugal. Day jumping down the coast, we also got to buddyboat with our friends aboard Taylor for a bit, enjoying some nice anchorages and also a nice waterfall hike. We also managed to squeeze in another few projects, like making DIY beanbags for the cockpit, which proved to be way more comfortable than our expensive folding chairs. We hauled out at Marina Mayra to take care of a few jobs, like getting some anti-fouling on the prop, installing a new chart plotter on a swivel at the helm, replacing some sinks, and getting some corrosion fixed on our rudder shoe. After having splashed, the weather started turning against us, and we ended up spending 2 weeks at the top of Rio de Vigo enjoying a lovely, although very rainy, anchorage. This area is featured in Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and was definitely not a bad place to be stuck for a couple of weeks. The weather finally started cooperating, and we continued down the coast of Portugal with our friends aboard Westwind, and had what I will probably classify as the most uncomfortable night I have ever had in a marina. Westwind, this is Athena.
Athena, Westwind.
You guys have seen the giant cruise ship coming in, right?
Yep, just wondering what I would like to do to not be in his way.
We made it safely another couple of miles down the coast to Porto, where we all went for a port wine tasting, and Eva fell in love with the colorful tiles on the houses. Jumping further down the coast, we got stuck in Fictafoss for a few days. If you're going to be sailing in Portugal, it's well worth it to keep an eye on the port statuses, as some ports tend to be closed even with just a moderate swell. After a wonderful sail further down the coast, we made it to Cascais, where it was yet again time for some DIY projects, like for instance installing our new wind vane, doing a service on the engine, and also provisioning the boat for the Atlantic crossing. Not seeing any good weather windows for the Canaries in the foreseeable future, we made another couple of day jumps down to Lagos on the very most southern tip of Portugal. 2022 felt like the first year where we were really cruising. I mean, we left Denmark the summer before and we spent the winter in Gosport, but all of that was mainly just projects. This is the first year where we've actually been moving. Now, as far as 2023, there's probably not going to be as many projects as there were in 2022, but there are still some things I'd like to add to Athena, like for instance, air conditioning, maybe an SSB radio, and then we also have some smaller finishing touches, like for instance, the headline, and also I have to finish the nav station. I hope you've enjoyed this little brief look at 2022. Now, with the current weather forecast, it looks like we have a weather window to go to the Canaries leaving tomorrow. That's going to be a roughly 600 nautical mile passage, and it should take us about 5 to 6 days. And just as with the Atlantic crossing, we're going to be sharing live updates and live position reports with our patrons. We'll end the video with a great big thank you to everybody.
Yeah, this has been such an incredible year, and we definitely would not be here or gotten this far without you guys. So thank you so much for all of your support.
Yep, and beyond that, we hope to see all of you guys back here aboard Athena next week for some sailing fun.
Yeah.
As always, feel free to leave a comment down below, and don't forget, if you've enjoyed this video,
Please remember to leave a like.
see you!
2023. Pew 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 pew.